I do wrong? Yeah. Oh, okay. I have to ask you again.
Well, it's my great pleasure to welcome with us Professor Hans Kamp. I think it's not necessary to spend too much of your time, which is reserved for you to talk, on introducing you to the audience. But still, I would like to say that Professor Kamp started his career in Holland, Leiden and Amsterdam, if I'm not mistaken, and then in the United States, in UCLA and in Austin, and finally he ended up at Stuttgart as a professor of formal logics and philosophy of languages. In one of the life stories which Professor Kamp wrote about himself, he said that he first wanted to study theoretical physics. And then by some chance or maybe intentional events, he, and that's what he says, changed one big hole for another big hole, and that's logic and semantics and pragmatics. And I think this is a very nice saying, so to say, or characterization. But I should add that while Professor Kamp left the whole of theoretical physics completely, or am I not right? Then certainly filled a lot of that hole for formal semantics and pragmatics. And that's what we will actually witness today when he will give us a talk on the mental states, DRT, Discourse Representation Theory. So I will stop here, and now the floor is yours.
Can you all hear me? So thank you very much, and especially also thank you for inviting me here. I've been to Prague a number of times, to the Institute of Eva and her husband Peter in the past, but I hadn't been to Prague for quite a while. Both everything that goes on in this institute and also this amazing city make me terribly grateful that I were invited back. Thank you. So this talk, which I hope is in the spirit of what people thought when they selected this particular theme, MSDRT, from a number of other alternatives, is about a way of doing, you might say, semantics and pragmatics of natural languages that's been under development now for quite a while, but especially the last 5 years or so. And much of what I will be presenting to you actually date from that more recent development. MSDRT, as the name suggests, it's short for Mental State Discourse Representation Theory. It's not a good name, it's very long, but at least the name suggests that it's got something to do with DRT, or Discourse Representation Theory, which is even quite a bit older and goes back to the late 70s and early 80s. And Eva suggested that I say a little bit about DRT before we get to MSDRT, so that, yeah, it's clear what kind of things that have to do with DRT, since MSDRT is just an extension of it, will be sort of clear to you when we get to MSD. So let me see if I get this right. While I was doing wrong. So what is it that I should click on?
Oh, I think you just
Just the scroller?
the scroller.
All right. And so I should get the cursor somewhere. Right. Okay. Good. So let's see if this works.
Yes.
Right. Right. So this is just to say that MSDRT is an extension of DRT, and now we go and look at some of DRT, and I decided to start what what do I do wrong? Okay. So I'm beginning with one of the well-known logical representations of DRT for a type of discourse that was very much an issue in the early 80s with informal semantics. And this is a so-called donkey discourse consisting of two sentences. That owns a donkey, and it goes on. He beats it, and the is this up here? Yeah. So the problem with this kind of discourse has to do with the way in which the pronoun relates to its antecedent, this indefinite noun phrase, a donkey. And in fact, the original examples that bothered the semantics, formal semantics community at the time were donkey sentences that go back to a book by Peter Geach, in which he unearthed this problem from medieval philosophy. If Peter owns a donkey, then he beats it. You have a similar problem about how the it relates to the a donkey. But here first, a donkey discourse, in some sense, is easier, but it shows two things, maybe even more. Namely, first, that if you want to give a systematic description of what goes on in this case with the it and the a donkey, you need something like a representation of a discourse consisting of more than one sentence, like in this example. And the idea is that to understand how people, human interpreters, do this, they must somehow get some representation out of the first sentence, and in particular of this indefinite noun phrase, a donkey, so that from that representation of the first sentence, they have all they need to get the right interpretation of the it over here. And so what DRT did in order to deal with this problem was to design a way of a regime of logical form, you might say, a way of representing sentences and discourses like what you see in this representation here, which does two things at the same time. And it, on the one hand, it correctly identifies, in a sense it has to be explained, the content of this first sentence. And that representation at the same time is such that you can systematically make the connections between this indefinite it contains here and the anaphoric pronoun. And that's what you see in this representation of the second sentence, where so crucial to these DRSs is they consist of two discourse representation structures, is that they consist of two parts, a so-called universe that is a set of so-called discourse reference as somehow in between constants and variables, if you think in traditional logical ways. And here, so the noun phrases are all supposed to introduce discourse reference, like the P for Pedro and the D for donkey. And here, also the pronouns he and it. And the connection between the two sentences of discourse is obtained by resolution of these pronouns, and that takes the form of identifying their discourse reference, the you for the he and the v for the it, with discourse reference that can be found in this structure that provides the antecedents for those pronouns. And then you put the two together. This discourse DIS is not fully defined by itself because it has these quasi-free variables, these the P and the D here. But when you put the two together, you get the discourse representation for the two sentences together, which correctly identifies the truth conditions of this discourse. That's a matter of how the whole system is set up, with the way in which these DRSs are computed from actually syntactic trees for these sentences, and then the model theory for this DRS language to which these DRSs like these belong. So that's, I can't tell you that story because you would never get it to MSDRT. But so that's basically how DRT functions. It provides a way of assigning logical forms, DRSs, to sentences and discourses where the DRSs do this double duty of identifying the content of what's been processed so far and providing the input needed for what is to be interpreted next, to serve, as you might put it, as discourse context for what comes next. So that pretty much gives what's in the comments here. I think I want to go straight, leave this stuff about model theory out for now, straight to a further complication of such systems that I must allow for, and that is related to these original donkey sentences. So here there are two such sentences, sort of classical examples from this work of Geach. If Peter owns a donkey, he beats it, a conditional and universal quantification, every farmer owns a donkey, beats it. In these sentences, as I already said, you have a similar kind of connection between the pronoun it and this indefinite noun phrase, a donkey. But now the further complication is that there is a kind of logical relation that we all know of between the bit that contains the antecedent and the bit that contains the consequent of this conditional. And here it's the restrictor of this quantifier, every, and the nuclear scope, as it's called, of that quantifier. So the logical representation, the logical form of these sentences has to capture that aspect of their meaning too. And that requires that you have to have certain complex constructs in these systems. It's true of all these dynamics, semantic systems that were developed in the wake of this and a similar approach. But there are important differences that I don't want to talk about. Something called file change semantics from Irene Heim, which was developed in roughly the same time. So here then in DRT, this extra complexity that one needs in order to capture at the same time in a systematic way the relation between pronouns and indefinite antecedent, and on the other hand, between, in this case, the restrictor, this is for this sentence over here, the restrictor part of the quantifier and the nuclear scope part, that requires a special construct, which you see here. This is this universal condition of DRT consisting of in some sense, the discourse context for the pronoun as restrictor and the part of the pronoun itself, nuclear scope. And the theory is set up in such a way that the same way of resolving these pronouns the it here and the he and the it over here in A, this same mechanism can be used to resolve these pronouns and to predict when a pronoun can take a certain antecedent and when not, something which I didn't mention so far, but that's part of what you want to do. And then at the same time, to relate the logical form for this part, the restrictor, and the logical form over here in the right logical way, so that this condition represents, in the way the system spells out, that every farmer B who owns a donkey beats that donkey. So that's the basis of DRT, and I would like to say not much more about it, but I want to ask if there's anybody who has a question up to this point. If not, then we go on. So MSDRT is this extension of DRT that was originally designed to deal with a problem in the semantics of propositional attitude attributions. When somebody says, John believes that Mary is in Paris, or things like that. John wants Mary to be at home. Or you have an attributee, John, and it is said of John that he has a particular propositional attitude, a belief or a desire or an intention or what. A problem that the philosophical literature has systematically overlooked or refused to deal with, at least for a long time. There may be things that I don't know in the meantime that also deal with this problem, but that's the problem posed by multiple attribution, like in 5. So Mary believes that a new drug has been found against brain tumors. She wants to get hold of it within the coming month. The problem with multiple attributions of the kind that's illustrated by this example has to do with the fact that this belief of Mary's that is reported in the first sentence might actually be false. You may have heard about this drug, but it doesn't really exist. And then you ask yourself, yeah, exactly, how should I interpret if I know that this it in the second sentence that wants to refer back to this indefinite new drug? And this is a problem that in a way seems very much like what you have in these donkey discourses and donkey sentences that I showed a moment ago. But there's one important difference, at least with the kinds of discourses that were considered in these first extensions from individual sentence semantics to discourse semantics. And that is that these discourses, like Pedro owns a donkey, he beats it, were all thought of as sequences of sentences with a kind of narrative pattern. You get the first sentence about something that was the case or happened, and then you get the next sentence, and it's supposed to say more about the same episode that the first sentence or situation that the first sentence also talks about. So that's what makes it possible to, after having first computed the DRS for the first sentence and then this DRS for the second sentence by itself, you can form this merger. It's just a kind of conjunction from the point of view of logic. But that is not what you want here. You don't want to analyze the it in the second sentence so that the content of this want that's reported here is just a conjunction of the content of the belief and the content of the want. You want to keep the want and the belief separate, because it's the combination of beliefs and wants that drives the whole process of practical reasoning. To really get a representation of it that does justice to the idea that what Mary may be expected to do is to do something that is based on her belief, but it is towards the goal of getting this drive. That must be captured also. And that makes the semantics of such discourses, such multiple attributions, much more complicated than the donkey discourses that we looked at a moment ago. And there are details about the model theory for the logical representations that MSDRT proposes for such multiple attributions that I cannot go into. It's a combination this is just a keyword for those to whom it means something. So later systems in dynamic semantics, in particular those of Groenendijk and Stockhoff, and especially the later ones together with Veltman, they have a sort of representation, logical representation language or logical language of dynamic semantics, in which the semantics is given by a combination of so-called information states on the one hand and so-called context change potentials on the other hand. These are notions that you already find in the dissertation of Irene Heim, but they use those to define, there's quite a bit more work to be done there, the logical representation languages they have. The model theory for the representation languages of MSDRT that can deal with such sentences also makes use of these combinations of information states and context change potentials, or CCPs. And that's one way of having your cake and eating it in this case, being able to transfer the existing algorithms for resolving pronouns on the one hand, and on the other hand, keeping the semantics of the want and the semantics of the belief separate in a way that you don't do with these discourses at the very beginning of DRT. So in a way, with DRT, you might say this problem also arises when you get other relations between sentences in the discourse. For instance, when the first sentence is suppose that a new drug against brain tumors has been released or something like that. There's then, and then you go on, this Mary wants to, or perhaps it will soon come on the market or something. There you also have a logical relation between the first and the second sentence, much like that between an antecedent and a consequent. So if you get into those problems like you get when you do SDRT, is a system developed by Nicholas Escher and Alex Laskaridis, where they make room within DRT for so-called discourse relations, like are expressed by but or although. So there's a range of discourse relations, and it's an important insight of linguists at the time that in order to understand the text, you have to establish these discourse relations between the different discourse units, different sentences roughly of the discourse. Unless you've succeeded in doing that, you haven't got a proper interpretation. So a proper theory like SDRT tries to provide on the basis of DRT is to actually say which discourse relations can be understood as holding between different parts of a given text or discourse. So if you get into SDRT, actually, you have this problem that's illustrated here also, but there's actually not all that much in SDRT that I know of that actually deals with a particular problem of keeping different bits of, roughly speaking, propositional content separate. So what does this look like? So this is the logical form for that multiple attribution we just saw. And it's important to say a little bit more about the details of this, because otherwise the rest won't be understandable. So the central idea behind MSDRT's solution to this problem of these donkey pronouns in multiple attributions is that what we are typically after when we make attitude attributions is to give a kind of picture of what's going on in the mind of the attributee. The interest in what things look like inside the mind of somebody else is very often, and I would think in the majority of cases where you actually make these attributions, in how the attributee is likely to act in the future or to explain why the attributee did certain things. A kind of story in this picture of decision theory, as you find it in philosophy and economics. Yeah, you want to understand how other people click. And when you give an attributions for the benefit of some other person, B, it's often to give him an idea of how this person clicks according to you. So the way in which the system is set up involves crucially something that you see here between these curly brackets. That's the curly brackets of set theory. It is a set consisting of several components, and these several components or constituents, they are the items in terms of which you convey through your attribution this picture of the attributees, in this case, this person Mary, mental state. And the complete expression of this is done by virtue of this predicate at. It is a special kind of predicate, and that, so to speak, is the expression of all that you need in first instance to go from DRT to MSDRT. It's a four-place predicate. This is the first predicate, it's first argument, sorry, that's for a state. And I'll explain to you why we want that in a minute. And that state is to the effect of what is expressed with the help of the next three arguments. This is for the attributee. This is for the description of the mental state that the logical form attributes to the attributee. And then there is a fourth component that I can't explain to you right now. That's got to do with how bits of what you see in here are connected with bits in other mental states. Forget about that for the moment, but it will be important. And so what you see then here more particularly is that this mental state that Mary is in, according to what the report says, consists of a belief that there is this new drug against brain tumors. Don't worry too much about how that's formalized. That's just sort of not to make things too complicated. That's been found. I think there was that was the verb in the example. So that's exactly what this, in DRT terms, what the belief that's attributed amounts to. And then the desire component is here. Separately, this bit that's contributed by the second sentence. We don't merge them in this case, and exactly how these two are related to each other, according to the system of which this is one of the representations, that is part of the model theory that I do not present here in the interest of time. And yeah, so if you're interested, you have to look up the literature on that. So the S here is there, as in most representations of DRT, in order to deal with tense and other aspects of temporality. So in this example, Mary believes that such and so, and she wants to get this drug in the next month. These are both present tenses, and the present tense means that the attributed bits, the belief in the desire, must be part of her mental state right now, and that's expressed over here by this thing over here. And there's something missing here. I'm sorry. So it should be clear that this T coincides with the utterance time in which the attribution is being made. So if the sentence had been in the past, then this T would have been located in the past of the utterance time. Here it's in the present, as coinciding with the utterance time. So we are evaluating, I should have said that already when we talked about DRT, we are actually evaluating not just sentences or discourses in the abstract, but particular utterances of those at particular times. And the tenses and other temporal features of the sentences then will tell us how these times are related to the utterance time. So how am I doing for time? How much more time do I have? Sorry? 20 minutes. Yeah, so it's quite clear that I won't get to the end of this, but that's all right. So the next thing that was added to MSDRT are entity representations. These entity representations are also constituents of mental states, it's assumed. And I think it's a very plausible assumption. We actually go around as living libraries of endless numbers of entities that we are familiar with, some of them by name, some of them in other ways. And a realistic theory of, even quite minimal theory of what these mental states as described in the theory should have by way of possible constituents should include these entity representations. These entity representations are constituents of mental states which serve the purpose of representing entities, as the name suggests, but they're not like propositional entities. They're not about propositions that you have a certain attitude to, but entities. And the idea is that these entity representations are formed by agents in response to things that they encounter. Things or people that they see, and maybe seeing for the first time. If you see something for the first time, you form an entity representation, and it becomes the entity representation of that thing you observe because of a certain causal relation that exists in perception between the thing perceived and the agent, and the representation that's constructed by the agent in such a case by, so that's the causal relation of perception. And in the formalization of entity representations used in MSDRT, here you can see the formalization involves three components. This first component is just to sort of mark the thing as an entity representation rather than as the representation of a propositional attitude. There is this alpha, that's the discourse referent that represents it's sort of a useful device, because otherwise you would have to repeat this thing all the time, for the entity represented. Then there is a DRS for some descriptive content that's associated with the entity representation as some of the information about the entity represented. And then there is an anchor set. And the anchor set, is, so to speak, makes the entity representation into the representation of the entity that it represents. It consists of so-called anchors, and these anchors are witnesses in the mind of the agent of events that have established this causal connection. So in the case of an entity representation that arises through perception, the anchor set will have a witness, an anchor, a perceptual anchor in this case, that witnesses the perception event that led to the introduction of the entity representation. And the entity representations, once they've been introduced, can be used again over and over. For instance, when the agent meets something or someone and recognizes that thing as something she already has a representation for. So a recognition is using an entity representation you have to link it with the perceptual or other sort of entity identifying event that is now taking place. And as a witness of this recognition event, appropriate anchor is added to the anchor set to record this new use of the entity representation. So these entity set, these anchor sets can be actually can become quite big, and there's various questions about how conscious the agent must be of what there is in this anchor set as part of what makes the entity representation a representation of what it represents, of its reference. But that's another theme that I can't go into. So entity representations then are absolutely crucial to the structure of many mental states. And an important further feature, which I haven't mentioned yet, is they can serve as arguments in predicates that are part of content specifications of propositional attitudes. And we do that by using this distinguished discourse reference alpha. So you will find such a discourse reference, distinguished discourse reference in other parts of the MSD, the mental state description, the stuff between the curly brackets that are propositional attitudes. And we'll see examples of that pretty soon also. So let me just skip this bit of text and look at one example of a mental state description, the stuff between the curly brackets that you have here that involves an entity representation as well as two propositional attitude representations. So this is the same multi-sentence, two-sentence attribution that we had before, but the belief that it's this new drug and the want to get some of it within the months. Now, and it's something that doesn't follow directly from the discourse, this multiple, this two attitude attribution to be looked at, but it could well be that Mary's mental state actually has an entity representation as well for the drug that she thinks has been invented. So if her belief is false, then this is actually a defective entity representation, doesn't represent anything. But from her own point of view, it might be that she thinks, oh yeah, there is this. So she has formed this entity representation of the drug, maybe on the basis of the information she's got out of some source of information. So you can form, that's part of the story, entity representations also on the basis of what other people say or write, and in particular on the basis of the names they use. We'll touch on that briefly later. So this is another possible representation of the mental state of Mary that this attribution talks about. And now you see there's actually a slightly different logical situation. This is the distinguished discourse referent of that entity representation. And you find that that then occurs both as argument in these predications of the belief and here of the desire. And so in a way, this is a logically different situation. Intuitively, if this entity representation properly does represent something, if the belief is true, then there is that particular thing in the world. And then this content here and this content here can both be understood as statements or assignments of properties to that externally existing entity, so they then both express singular propositions, as the term goes in philosophy, about that entity. And this connection, the dependence of this on that we had in the representation, where we didn't have the entity representation here, is no longer a problem. We have just two independent singular propositions expressed by the belief content and the desire content. So there is a sort of display, or sorry, a kind of different ways of representing content that attributes certain complex mental states to people, which have to do with whether there is such an entity representation or not. But that's what the theory also does deal with in a proper way. Sorry, not to finish the sentence. Now, another problem. Sorry? So here we have a sentence with two names. Mary is in Paris. And one way of dealing with proper names, the way in which proper names were dealt with in DIT wasn't really very satisfactory, and that's true of earlier standard forms of formal semantics. Also, like Montague grammar in its various forms, we just introduce it in DIT, just introduce a discourse referent and then have a predicate say, like M, and then saying, have a condition, say, M is Mary or Mary M. That actually sort of is unsatisfactory from almost any point of view that you can think systematically about proper names. And in particular, it is unable to do justice to this idea that many people, I am among them, have embraced after this famous set of lectures of Saul Kripke's Naming a Necessity, that names actually enter the community through some kind of baptism and then sort of spread through the community by one person who has maybe been present at this baptism or knows about it, using the name in the presence of somebody else who's never heard the name of the other person. Then suppose you learn that there is this person called so-and-so or thing called so-and-so, and that's part of that story, can take over as part of the speech community to which he or she belongs, that name as a way of referring to the same thing that the person referred to when she used the name from which the agent I was talking about picks up the name. So there's this kind of transfer of the name from the one person to the other, which is not just a form of the name, but also implicitly that it's to be used to the same referent that the original or the first speaker used it to refer to. And if you want to capture that sort of thing, then it is, well, a little more. It is important to actually go about semantics in a rather different way from what it had been since the sort of founding papers of Richard Montague, and then also in DAT and large chain semantics, where in all these systems, what you're trying to do is to give the relevant semantic properties, in particular truth conditions, of bits of the language that you study, English or some other natural language. What we need here is a social dimension to the way in which language works, that these approaches are fundamentally unable to capture. You might even say it's something that they don't want to capture. They want to understand the languages or language fragments one studies as sort of belonging to an independent system with its own syntax and semantics, and of course phonology, that members of the speech community can buy into. They can buy into it by learning the language in some way or another. And yeah, that is what you have to also be able to address formally if you want to make sense of this whole idea of Kripke's, and some other people at the time were talking about this 1970 roughly, that this is how proper names work in languages. So what we need in order to achieve such a formalization, and it sort of also relates to the very last part of the talk that I won't be able to come to, but in a way we are coming to it at this point also, is a systematic description of what utterances that speakers produce not only mean according to the language as an abstract system, but also in relation to what the speaker herself has in mind that she wants to express by the words she uses. And then, and that's the even more important part of this, also to track what can be expected to happen in the mind of a competent speaker who interprets what the speaker says by way of how his attitudes, his mental state gets changed, in particular on account of the interpretation that he constructs of the speaker's words. So let's see. Oh yeah, this will do for the moment. Sorry. This is what we assume to be part of the mental state of the speaker and the recipient just before the speaker says Mary is in Paris. Now, I'm assuming it is only one of a number of different scenarios that both the speaker and the hearer have representations for the entities named Mary and Paris that occur in the sentence. So they both have a mental state where there is an entity representation for the Mary that the speaker talks about and for Paris, so thinking about Paris in France. And then the question is, what happens when the utterance gets made and interpreted So this is just the DRS that gets constructed for this sentence. It is extremely primitive. It's that there is a state that's surrounding the utterance time of Mary being in Paris. But so this is what they both can sort of establish on the basis of as a further part of their mental states and based on these entity representations that they both are assumed to have. But so this is the mental state in particular that the hearer will be in after he has received the utterance. Now has, a further thing has to be said. So he gets this statement from S, and let's assume that he actually accepts what S says as true and forms a corresponding belief. So one of the updates of the mental state of H is now that he has this belief with this belief content we already said. So now, in a way, you might think this is the end of the story, and we sort of can measure what H has learned by comparing this mental state description with the one we had before. But there is another really important dimension that's essential to try to capturing what, according to Kripke and Chastain and others, goes on when people get new names through taking them over from others. And that is what's called a vicarious anchor. Let's skip this one. Vicarious anchor in MSDRT. Vicarious anchors, as distinct from the perceptual anchors I talked about before, that are witnesses of events of perception. Vicarious anchors are anchors that are added to the anchor set of entity representations in cases where such a takeover takes place. That is, the speaker uses a certain name, say Mary, and the hearer interprets this name by using one of his own entity representations labeled by Mary, and then he adds a vicarious anchor to his anchor set as a witness to this event of his getting the name in this way. So I realized I should go a step back and say something more about the way in which MSDRT reconstructs the causal chain theory of names. So the idea is that a proper use of a name by a speaker always presupposes and requires that she have an entity representation that's labeled by that name. And so the names play the part of labels of entity representation that's encoded by such clauses like M is named Mary. So M here, that's the distinguished discourse reference. The M represents the entity representation as a whole here, and so must be thought of as representing the entity that's represented by the entity representation. And this says of that entity that its name, one of its names, is Mary. So using in the standard way that we use proper names, a proper name requires that the speaker have an entity representation, and likewise the interpretation of a proper name used standardly on the part of the interpreter requires that he have an entity representation also labeled by that name that he can now use to identify the referent the entity to which the speaker has referred by using the name. So names are sort of vehicles between entity representations on the part of the discourse participants. And so the interesting case is, from the point of view of the change theory, is that where H actually doesn't have such an entity representation and has to accommodate one so that the normal way of interpreting the use of a name can be still upheld after having accommodated an entity representation for the entity that the speaker has referred to. Once you've accommodated that, as I hear, you can then use the same procedure for interpreting the name, but you have to make this first step first. And that's what, so to speak, introduces you into the community, the speech community that has the ability to use the name to refer to the thing that the speaker has used to refer it to. And so when a recipient, H, doesn't have an entity representation, must accommodate one, then he will introduce into the anchor set of that newly accommodated entity representation a so-called vicarious anchor. That's a testimony to, I got this use of the name Mary from this particular event of the speaker using it and my interpreting what the speaker said. So in this case, the anchor set will consist only of this vicarious anchor here, and so this bit will be empty. But in fact, when H is in a position to interpret the name use of the speaker properly, because he already has an entity representation that he takes to represent the same entity that the speaker was referring to, then also, as in these other cases where you have new uses of existing entity representations, such a vicarious anchor gets added as a kind of testimony to, yeah, the speaker has now been using the name Mary to refer to what's represented by my entity representation. So this kind of analysis of how competent speakers who obey the rules of the language can produce the words that, according to the rules of the language, correctly interpret or express what they want to say, and on the other hand, how competent listeners can, for their part, add to their mental states the results of their interpretations. And if they both keep to the rules, then things will typically work out right. So the content representation of the ear will match the content representation that the speaker wanted to express. And there may still be difficulties that have to do in particular with how references take place. So one actually quite interesting attested cases that I came across from the psychological literature. It often happens that when a speaker uses a certain name, especially first names or common second names of people, the recipient has an entity representation, maybe a whole list of entity representations named by that, labeled by that name, and he will pick one of these entity representations to interpret the particular use the speaker has made. And as a matter of fact, that entity representation that he uses refers to a different entity, a different person, so-called, than the one that the speaker was referring to. So you get, obviously, all sorts of confusions there, and then there's an interesting question of how they get resolved. And so I don't know too much about all the sort of scenarios that it would be worth playing through, but it's obviously something that often happens, and this is a formal framework for for investigating that more closely. So I should stop talking. Let me just, as a way of almost stopping talking, say, if you have a handout, you can see that there's still a number of things that I wanted to at least have mentioned. And they're all actually quite interesting. First, there's the question of what happens when names occur in the content specifications of attitude attributions. So you say John believes that Mary is in Paris. There's three proper names there, but the last two are actually in the specification of John's belief. And so continuing the story I was just telling, in this case, the speaker of this sentence must have entity named entity representations for all three, John, Mary, and Paris. But there's also a question exactly about what the attributee has, what we can say about his mental state on the basis of the attribution made to him, assuming that the attribution is correct. And so there is a further claim: when the content of his belief is specified by the speaker using names like here, Mary, and Paris, that must, this is a separate claim from anything I've said so far, is about the use of names in the specification of attitude contents. The attributee must also, in that case, have entity representations for the entities that the speaker uses in her statement, the names to refer to. There's no need for him to have also these same name labels for his entity representations, but the attribution that the speaker makes can only be understood. This is a claim about English and other natural languages, can only be understood as attributing to him a mental state complex of which there is an entity representation that refers to the entity that the speaker uses the name to refer to. And that's the point of this. It's not all of them there, but of this link. So this is, as I say, a claim about how these uses of names in attributions work. So this link that consists of pairs of a discourse reference that you find in one of the entity representations of this MSD that is being attributed to the attributee, sorry, and one that's outside. So in this case, this means that the entity representation that, according to the attribution, John must have for this person that is, that's represented by this entity representation. The entity represented of that must be the same as the Mary so that is represented by this discourse referent M at the highest. So link sets are there in order to make such connections between attributors and attributees, which sometimes involve sameness of reference in a way that is explained here. So that's one further aspect of the using of names. Then there is a long section about non-referring names, like you have in fiction, or also in cases where there is fiction, but people got things wrong. There's this example about the name Vulcan of this planet that was supposed to explain certain aberrations in the orbit of Mercury, which turned out to be an untenable hypothesis. There never was a planet called Vulcan, but then it was picked up by Krepke, and now philosophers talk about it all the time, and that's interesting. There are lots of other examples of that too, but where you have a mixture of people who believe that the name has a proper reference at some time or other, and other people who perhaps at other times do not believe that. And there is an interesting question about how you can communicate. It's really so hard. So you need other things than entity representation to deal with that, but that can't really is. Now, then there is a point that can be made in 2 sentences about iterated attributions. This formalism for representing attitude attributions can also be used to make attributions of some attributions of attitude attributions. So yes, the sentence Wilma hopes that John believes that Mary is in Paris. We already saw John believes that Mary is in Paris, and that is now embedded into this hope. And it should be clear how this works. I mean, you have these DRSs that are representations of these attitude attributions. They can be used as content specifications of other attitude attributions or attitude representations. So these combinations of a mode indicator like belief or desire and this DRS for the content can be made part of the MSD that goes in 3rd position of this at predication, and the at predications are then sort of conditions of DRT in the standard sense, and so it can be combined with other things in the condition set and then make a DRS there out of that, sorry. And so what you get is something that looks like this. And you can iterate that process indefinitely. So iterated attitude attributions, which also have a long thought to be a real problem, actually are caught or represented quite naturally in this framework. And again, that you get the right results has to do with the model theory for these structures. So I should really be in a position to show you that, but it takes time. Then finally, I already mentioned this use of MSDRT as a kind of communication-theoretic framework, and where you keep track of the speaker and the hearer. And here, I just, without showing you anything, want to draw attention to one thing that's also quite interesting and needs explanation, and that is that when you have 2 discussion partners, like here, Johnny and Mummy, and the one believes that a certain individual, here it's Santa Claus, exists and the other does not, they can still communicate quite well with each other. The other one who doesn't believe that Santa Claus exists has to be a little careful in what she says. But this is a case where you get very much the same sort of thing that I was saying before about speaker and here with this Marius in Paris. And so that's another application of MSDRT in this communication theoretic variant of it. And then at the very last page, I have listed some other things that you can do with DRT, but I should now shut up.
Thank you very much for your talk. I'm looking forward to the informal cup of tea discussion tomorrow afternoon, where we can go to maybe more general issues. So first, I will open the floor for discussion. We still have 15 minutes.
Well, I would like to learn more in detail the report, which is between your mental state theory and the cognitivist approach, in which mental states are also appear. If I have understood well, the cognitivist approach, which by far is not mine, claims that the language meaning is not to be searched into the relation between language forms and the outside world, but between language thoughts and collective inner mental. Right. So the collective dimension is important. In your approach. There is no collectivity as far as
there is, maybe not the way you would want it, but in what I've said, I've tried in the last part to emphasize the importance of this social dimension to the way in which we use language, and also the way in which languages grow as a consequence of that. So when language users take over names with their reference from other speakers, they actually buy into language as the possession of the language community. And it is, I should add, and it is something that I don't find very often mentioned in the literature, this kind of taking over a name by, as I sort of try to spell it out here, accommodating an entity representation for it, and then adding this vicarious anchor to its anchor set. That is a way of this speaker to sort of buy himself into the language community as far as this particular name, this particular user is concerned. And that is a much more general phenomenon when we learn concept words, just as much as when we learn the meanings of names and other. So the theory needs to be extended to try to get at that aspect of meaning as grounded in common understanding by adding a theory about the form of concepts. And there's a beginning of that. So that actually goes more in the direction, I think, that you were querying. And that might, in the end, cover a very large part of the language. It's dynamic, so the way in which new speakers acquire the language and new concepts get introduced and sort of spread through the community in the same way that names do, according to this causal chain theory. One problem that I have found, so no, another sentence just before. So that is important, but one should also do justice to the way in which language relates to the world. So that's what the model theory is for. And I haven't told you much about it, so it's difficult to say more about it. But so that's sort of a standard, as I understand it, assumption of formal semantics, that if you do it in that way that Montague started with, a model theory for the representation language. The model theory gives you the connection between form of what you say and its actual denotation. But the social dimension is there also, and it's absolutely crucial to be able to get it. One problem, and I have sort of, can't say I struggled with it, but been irritated by it now at least for 40 years, is that from cognitive science, there has been astoundingly little by way of contributions of whatever level of representations they assume, what the mental representations are of what's expressed by expressions in natural language. If they had something really useful to say that could be combined with this, or that one could use to test theories like the ones I've talked about, I'd be only too happy. But there is still a very, very deep gap between what they have been doing so far and what this is trying to get at.
So, thank you. And now there's some further questions.
Thank you very much for the talk. I'm not sure if my question is correct, but I'd like to ask, you had examples like Mary believes or something like that, and I'm wondering if sentences with other cases of attribution are kind of similar, or if you consider that of similar structure, like New York Times reports that. Is it something similar or is it completely different?
Somewhere in between. Yeah, no. So there is an enormous range of different attitude verbs in English. I mean, this is, people always talk about belief and desire, maybe intention, with doubts and hopes and suspicions. And I mean, just in the doxastic domain as alternative verbs to the verb believe, right? There is an enormous range, and there is an enormous range for good reasons, because there are subtle distinctions that we make by choosing between those verbs, and a good theory of propositional attitude reports should actually be able to explain what these differences are. And it's a fascinating and an interesting enterprise, and it's one that should be executed. And what I've been telling you here is only the very beginning. It's still very old-fashioned. It's at least the examples that I've given here stick more or less to the standard repertoire of the philosopher, like belief and desire and intention. There's a little bit more about hope and wonder, but that's an enormous project, and it is very, anybody can help with that. Well, should encourage. Yeah, I don't know. So then, so there is this connection with verbs like report. So it's a kind of these verba decendi, as I sometimes call these verbs that we use for various ways of saying, communicating, yeah, verbs of saying. And that, I mean, those verbs differ from the attitude verbs in that there is a very different kind of sincerity condition. So with normal assertions, yeah, there's the question, does the speaker really mean that or not? And that is also something you can analyze if you have, on the one hand, the utterance with its syntax and semantics, and on the other hand, what's going on in the mental state of the speaker. And with these, yeah, so with verbs of saying, that particular aspect, not the only one, but that particular aspect of sincerity also comes in quite naturally. If the New York Times, if you say the New York Times said such and so, such, there is on the one hand the question whether the New York Times did say that, but the question that I was wanting to focus on now is, did they speak honestly? How did what they said relate to, well, what the editors thought? And here's a problem that's also, I find with epistemic modals, like might, in the sense of to the extent that I know she could do that, that it's much more difficult to actually have an attributee So if you were to use this at predicate with these, so as it was done here, so when you have an attribution from John believes in such and such, then it's clear what goes into the second slot. It's just a discourse reference for John. But if you have these cases that you are bringing up, it's very unclear exactly who is the carrier of that content. And that's a very, very hard problem that I don't know quite what to do with.
Very interesting. Thank you.
Well, I just will indicate what kind of questions I will have tomorrow.
Yeah.
One concerns the very notion of a mental state, because it somehow leads me to psychology, and that relates to the question which Tom had.
Yeah.
And the other question is, I mean, going up to psychology or going down to the very form of the sentences, because well, syntax, I mean, linguistically interpreted syntax doesn't seem to play much role.
Oh, it
Because
does. No,
in
no,
one
no,
of
no.
your sentences, there was an embedded predicate from which you
Yeah.
went by the reference.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
So, so my general question would be, I mean, is it so that syntax just doesn't play any role?
No, it couldn't not play any role. I mean, not by the sort of general assumptions that I think pretty much everybody in formal semantics operates. And the point you spot is absolutely right. These representations have shown of attitude attributions. I've got this all this stuff with the at predicate and the MSD and so forth that looks like nothing you find in these sentences, right? So the syntax semantics interface for these representation languages and this sort of sentences and these multi attributions is something that is quite complex, has to be complex, and it's one point where you could object to the whole system. And well, since you've asked the question now, I can sort of look up something that I could show you what this looks like in individual cases, and it's not obvious. And I should add to that that's one difference between DRT, if you look at everything that's been done within it, and MSDRT. So in DRT, the really hard work has always gone into formulating the syntax semantics interface, the way in which you translate sentences into DRSs. And there is quite a large literature on that, with very considerable coverage also, at least of English. With MSDRT, that doesn't exist yet. I've worked out a number of examples of how this works, and I think you can see quite well how this might be extended to a sort of general description of the syntax semantics interface, but it exists so far only by example. But among the examples are some of those that you've just seen, and there's the syntax semantics interface really spelled out.
Okay, thank you very much. Well, to conclude, I would like to repeat our congratulations to your Rorschach Prize. I think we have, when we advertise your talk, we mentioned that this is supposed to be a prize like Nobel Prizes. I mean, it's a Nobel Prize for disciplines which don't have any Nobel Prize for themselves.
Yeah.
So,
it's also very small Nobel Prize.
Okay, so congratulations.
Thank you.
Many thanks that you just spend the time with us. I hope it will not last another 20 years when we meet.
I think, given my age, it better happens a little earlier.
Well, don't speak about age. So again, many thanks. Thank you for coming. And I should say that for the regular attendees, that the next Monday has been changed, I mean, the program, because European Union is something which is above us, and we have to organize a kind of conference, or whatever you may call it, in our building, and because the interests of people somehow are not too much far from those which will be discussed here next Monday, we decided to postpone the talk scheduled for Monday till spring term, and we will announce the date. So please look at the announcement of the Monday European event, register and attend. And once more, thank you for coming, and see you in 2 weeks from now. Yes. Okay.